Warmest greeting from the Leader Associate, my dear audience. Wherever where you're from, I hope you're well. My name is Randall, Assistant Content Analyst of the Leader Associates. I'm the host of today's webinar. Welcome to Impact Australian Wind Day, Legislating Australian Wind Future, Day 1 of the APAC Energy Week 2023 Live. Australia is currently the most watched wind energy market across APAC and the top lead in the terms development timelines. With a world-class wind resource and a series of solid regulatory processes in place, the wind industry in Australia, especially the offshore wind industry, is standing at the tipping point of the success. Nevertheless, while the hype around wind in Australia is all-time high, what can we expect from the market in the next phase, and how can we accelerate the build-out process through past lessons learned? As we look ahead to 2023, today's Impact webinar aims to learn from the industry's top minds and collectively shed light to the future. For today's agenda, it will consist 2 ministerial keynotes pre-recorded by the Hon.Matt Kean, New South Wales Treasurer and the Minister of the Energy, as well as the Ms. Hon.Matt, Executive Director of the Victoria's DEECA, followed by the 3 market keynotes depicting the Australian wind outlook, policy and technology possibility contributed by the Aurora Energy Research, Hamilton Locke, and GHD. At the end, an industry leaders panel is also encouraged to highlight the pathway of the Gippsland as an Australian pilot offshore wind zone, joined by the Lateral Valley Authority, AEMO, Coral Generation, Blue Float, and moderated by the KPMG. We would also like to encourage all the audience attending the session raise the question in the Q&A box. Should you have any, our assistants on site will be happy to direct. Today's webinar is also a prelude conference of the our official event Australia Wind Energy 2023 to head in 25 to 26 July MCEC in Melbourne. Over 2,000 APAC wind C-suite expected to attend this year's show, which are already confirmed by stakeholders including the NIPSOMA, Energy Co, Goldwind Australia, Coral Generation, Blue Float, Engie, Powerlink Queensland, and more. As today's we have very compact schedule, without further ado, I would like to first play the ministerial video kindly recorded by the Hon.Matt Kean, as well as Ms. Hon.Matt. Please kindly reminded that the 2 videos will be combined length of the 10 minutes. The watching experience may vary depending on the audience bandwidth. Should you look for the smoother watching experience, you can also click the link in the chat box. Watch the video on the website. The video is not very long. Please stay tuned and listen. Thank you.
Brian, Molly, do you have my presentation or will I be required to share it?
Hey, Matt, I'm going to do from my own end. So I'm going to share my own copy just for your information. Might be easier for you.
Sorry, you can do your own your PowerPoint. If you're not working, so I can do it for you.
That's no problem. I'm happy to share.
Okay. 有没有声音？ Warmest greeting from the Leader Associate, my dear audience. Wherever where you're from, I hope you're well. My name is Ryan Liu, Ascent Connect Analyst of the Leader Associate. I'm the today's hoster of today's webinar. Welcome to Impact Australian Wind Day. Legislating Australian Wind Future, Day 1 of the APAC Wind Energy Week Live 2023. Australia is currently the most watched wind energy market across APAC, of the top lead in the terms of the development red lines. With a world-class wind results and a series of the solid regulatory progress in the place, the wind industry in Australia, especially the offshore wind industry, is standing at the tipping point of the success. Nevertheless, while the hype around wind in Australia is all-time high, what can we expect from the market in the next phase? And how can we accelerate the build out the process through past lessons learned? As we look ahead to 2023, today's Impact webinar aims to learn from the industry's top mind and collectively shed light to the future. So for today's agenda, it will consist two ministerial keynotes pre-recorded by Hon.Matt Kean, New South Wales Treasurer and Minister of the Energy, as well as the Ms. Hon.Matt, Executive Director of the Victoria's DEECA, followed by the three market keynotes depicting the Australian wind outlook, policy, and new technology possibility, contributed by Aurora Energy Research, Hamilton Locke, GHD. At the end, an industry leaders panel is also encouraged by highlight a pathway of the Gippsland as Australian pilot offshore wind zone, joined by the Latrobe Valley Agency, IEMO, Coral Generation, Blue Float, and moderated by the KPMG. We would also like to encourage all the audience attending the session to raise questions in the Q&A box. Should you have any, our assistants on site will be happy to direct. So for today's webinar, so it's also Impact also prelude conference, our potential event, Australia Wind Energy 2023 to head in 25 to 26 July 2023 EMEC in Melbourne. Over the 2,000 APAC wind C-suite are expected to attend this year's show, with already confirmed key stakeholders including Nipsoma, Energy Co, Goldwind Australia, Coral Generation, Blue Float, ENGIE, PowerLink, Queensland, and more. As today, we have a very compact schedule without further ado. I would like to first play the ministerial video kindly recorded by the Honorable Matt Kean, as well as the Ms. Hon.Matt. Please be kindly reminded that the two videos will be combined length of the 10 minutes. The watching experience may be very depends on the audience bandwidth. Should you look for the smoother watching experience, you can also click the link in the chat box. Watch the video on the website. The website is not very long. Please stay tuned and listening. Thank you.
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of New South Wales and pay my respects to the elders past and present. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak at the 2023 APAC Wind Energy Week Impact webinar. Wind energy will have an important part to play in delivering New South Wales's clean energy future. It's all part of implementing the New South Wales Electricity Infrastructure Roadmap, which is our plan to deliver the electricity infrastructure that we need to modernise our electricity system and to power our economy. We're building 5 massive renewable energy zones across the state to produce clean, cheap electricity for generations to come and create major investment opportunity for industry, including small businesses. There are currently 16 major operating wind farms in New South Wales with a total capacity of over 1,800 megawatts. And as of November 2022, 4 wind farms were under construction and a further 8 had planning approval. Taken together, these 12 wind farms represent a $4.3 billion investment in the future of energy in our state. While onshore wind so far remains a lower cost and faster to develop solution, there is growing interest in developing our state's offshore wind resources. EnergyCo is working with the federal government and relevant New South Wales government agencies to inform the next steps under the national framework for licensing offshore generation off the coast of the Hunter and the Illawarra regions. Wherever possible, we want to seize the opportunities provided by the energy transition to develop manufacturing industries for renewable energy in New South Wales. For this reason, the government will invest $250 million over 5 years through the Renewable Manufacturing Fund to boost local manufacturing for renewable energy to support good jobs in our state in this vital global industry. Manufacturing of wind towers and other components for wind farms will be eligible for funding, including for offshore wind. New South Wales has led the nation in the developing of policies and programs to allow us to make the most of our abundant renewable energy resources. From amending our Forestry Act to enable renewable energy infrastructure, including wind farms to be established within state forests, to creating $1.2 billion electricity transmission acceleration facility to fast-track the next generation of energy infrastructure. New South Wales is committed to developing the renewable energy that delivers for consumers and communities and is a fair deal for proponents. Our roadmap gives investors the confidence and certainty to invest in our world-class wind, solar and hydro resources. Wind energy is part of the future of our state, and I wish you all a very productive discussion during the APAC Wind Energy Week.
So, after listening to the enlightening presentation by the Honorable Matt Kean, it gave us a taste of the New South Wales ambition for the energy transition. Ms. Hon.Matt, Executive Director of the Offshore Wind Energy Victoria Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, DEECA, belong to the Victoria's government, showcasing to you Victoria's commitment for the offshore wind. So let's hear what she would like to say.
Hello everyone. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking, the Wurundjeri people. And given some of today's participants are also joining virtually from around Australia, the traditional owners of all communities across our nation, I pay my respects to their elders past and present, as well as any elders who may have joined us today. I am delighted to be representing the Honourable Lily D'Ambrosio, Victoria's Minister for Energy and Resources, at this Impact Offshore Wind webinar as part of APAC Wind Energy Week. Victoria leads Australia in the transition to clean energy and a net zero 2045 future. And offshore wind is one of the most exciting renewable energy technologies in the world today. Given Victoria has the best offshore wind resource in Australia and among the best globally, it's fitting that our state is leading the development of offshore wind in Australia. Offshore wind is already a major energy source for Europe and is being developed at large scale in both Asia and America. Its high capacity factor and different supply profile to onshore wind makes it a perfect complement to our booming onshore wind and solar industries and a key pillar in Victoria's future energy supply infrastructure. Today I'm going to be speaking in detail about Victoria's burgeoning offshore wind industry, starting with a look at some of the factors that make our state the natural home for Australia's offshore wind industry. The first of these, and the most important, is our world-class natural wind resources. Across the state, we have consistently high commercially viable wind speeds. We also have a relatively shallow and stable sea floor, which is ideal for fixed platform developments. Victoria offers a sophisticated, competitive and transparent electricity market. Thanks to our advanced manufacturing and established supply chains, wind energy investors and developers enjoy many efficiencies. We have a highly skilled workforce with strong engineering and digital technology capabilities. Our infrastructure is world-class, including road and rail networks, great telecommunications infrastructure, aviation hubs that handle a third of the nation's air freight, and Australia's busiest seaport, which links to a fast-growing Asia-Pacific market. Over the last 3 state budgets, the Victorian Government has announced a record $2 billion in clean energy investment. This is Victoria setting the standard for investment in renewables. In October last year, the Victorian Government released our first offshore wind implementation statement, which outlines our plans for an offshore wind industry. The offshore wind implementation statement includes announcements and updates on a coordinated transmission approach to bring offshore wind online, a ports approach to support offshore wind construction, and the establishment of Offshore Wind Energy Victoria, OWEV, a dedicated government-led one-stop shop for sector development and industry and community engagement. It's important to note that there can be no renewable energy transition without transmission. We understand how critical it is to deliver the coming wave of renewable energy from offshore wind smoothly into our electricity grid. The Victorian Government will be coordinating the delivery of transmission infrastructure for offshore wind through VicGrid, a division in DEECA, which is coordinating the overarching planning and development of Victoria's renewable energy zones, or REZs. By taking this approach, we are ensuring that the transmission solution we deliver is not only cost-effective, but also balances the concerns and priorities of local communities, traditional owners, industry, and Victorian electricity consumers. Equally important to the success of our burgeoning offshore wind sector is ensuring that we have the right facilities in the right locations to support our ambitious goals. The Port of Hastings is likely to be the preferred port to support offshore wind construction, subject to necessary community and industry consultation and environment and planning approvals. Port of Hastings has the naturally deep water shipping channels and extensive, suitably zoned land, which could be developed to support this emerging offshore wind sector, including local manufacturing. The Victorian Government will be releasing further implementation statements to provide further updates on our offshore wind program this year. With the foundation we have created, we are locking in the establishment and growth of the offshore wind industry in Victoria and positioning our state as Australia's leader in offshore wind. But this is only the beginning. We are seizing the opportunity and committing to a pipeline of offshore wind projects in the coming years that will see our state become a player of global standing in the international offshore wind industry. Studies show that our coastal regions offer the potential to support an enormous 13 gigawatts of capacity by 2050. At 13 gigawatts, these offshore wind projects would generate up to 6,100 jobs. A pipeline of offshore wind projects in the coming years will be underpinned by an industry development and support framework that draws on our successful experience with our Victorian renewable energy target options and overseas experience in establishing offshore wind industries. In conclusion, Victoria is leading the transition to clean energy in Australia. Our commitment to the offshore wind sector will provide the foundation for the next phase of that transition. The additional renewable energy capacity that offshore wind delivers will help smooth the transition as old, unreliable coal-fired power stations exit the market. It will also provide thousands of jobs and billions of dollars in investment for regional Victoria. I hope you enjoy the rest of this webinar. Thank you.
So Ms. Hon.Matt described how well establishment, the regulatory regime and government policy and financial support have contributed to positive of the offshore wind industry in Victoria. Victoria is now the leader of the offshore wind industry and a very influential player globally. Looking at the countries as a whole, what does Australia have to offer and how can expect in the future? So let's welcome Ms. Hugo, the Managing Director, APAC, Aurora Energy Research. Let's move to stage to Ms. Hugo.
Thanks, Ryan. I just want to confirm that you can both hear me and see my screen now.
Yes, we can see it.
Terrific. Well, a big thank you for having me here today, and terrific starting speeches from both Minister Kean and Anne, who are deeply committed and an expert in this area. My name's Hugo Batten. I run Aurora across APAC. We're an energy modelling firm, so we model markets and grids, and we're active in Australia, Europe, the US and Japan, all of which are very active onshore and offshore markets. We've also been involved in modelling the New South Wales roadmap, which Minister Kean spoke about, but also the offshore wind program for the VIC, so deep experience in those two areas as well. I've been asked today to talk for 20 minutes and basically provide a current overview of the policy wind landscape in Australia. So I'll step through some basics. I'm sure this will be familiar to many people on the line, but hopefully helpful to set a platform. Let me just see if I can flick between slides. There we go. Terrific. So as ever in Australian energy, there's a lot going on in renewables. So starting off with the Commonwealth Government, there's a legislated net zero target by 2050 with 43% emissions reductions from 2005 levels by 2030. In terms of the way that is delivered, obviously you've got the Clean Energy Finance Corporation and to a lesser extent ARENA now supporting renewable and other clean technologies. The major policy that was delivered under the election was the Rewiring the Nation policy, so significant additional spend on transmission to unlock additional renewable capacity. At the federal level, you've also for a while now held LGCs, but there are also consultations running on REGOs, so an additional support for renewables that, as the renewable energy targets are met, is likely to replace LGCs, but also support renewables over the long term. So there's a reasonable amount of action happening at the federal level under the current Labor government. As Minister Kean indicated, New South Wales for a while now has had its electricity infrastructure roadmap. It's delivering additional renewable capacity. The target is 12 gigawatts by 2030, which is certainly ambitious. And I think there's some indication in the industry that 12 gigawatts is seen as difficult to achieve. So we run a survey of our subscribers, about 120 organisations in the NEM, and the consensus figure was 9 gigawatts by 2030. So that's wisdom of the crowds, make of it what you will. But just the challenges given current supply chains and transmission delivery as to how much we'll be able to deliver. That will also, as part of that program, deliver firming capacity, so particularly long duration storage. They've set up a number of renewable energy zones, starting with Central West Aurora and New England, but also looking at offshore renewable energy zones as well, off the Hunter, I think. Queensland, some major announcements over the last 6 months. Their renewable energy target of 50% by 2030, 70% by 2032, and 80% by 2035. You've got CleanCo, the state government-owned entity, which is writing offtake for renewables to help meet that target, and also the super grid, so a lot of additional 500 kV lines to help ameliorate grid issues. In Victoria, as Anne touched on, aggressive renewable energy targets after the last election, 65% by 2030, 95% by 2035. Offshore wind targets, 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, and 9 gigawatts by 2040. And I'll get into the detail on that a little bit. And also a Victorian transmission investment framework to help deliver the transmission required to connect those renewables. South Australia is obviously further along the journey, but has its own suite of policies as well. I think the general criticism of this suite of policies is that it is a kind of fairly clear fragmentation of the NEM. So each state pursuing their own decarbonisation and security of supply targets through various mechanisms. And the criticism might be that, is this the optimal way to deliver a decarbonised NEM? The whole underlying thesis of the NEM was benefits of trade between states, and running it as an integrated system would deliver more economically efficient outcomes. in chasing these aggressive decarbonisation targets, do we risk putting that system at risk? That's open debate. I think the other criticism is there's a lot of out of wholesale market signals now for new generation, and that risks distorting both the wholesale and contract market in the NEM. Tim Nelson and others have written about that at fairly great and articulate length. And did a terrific job summarising the Victorian offshore wind proposal. So I won't spend too long on this. And I've touched on the targets already. What is missing, I think, but I suspect will be delivered under the implementation study or statement that's due later this year, is what kind of support will be available for offshore wind. CFDs, as we've done in Europe, 15-year fixed price vanilla CFDs in the UK, price floors, I think, in Germany. A number of different mechanisms out there, concessional debt grants, a whole pile of different options. But I think the industry is very keen to see what those support mechanisms will look like, and then what the auction timelines will be. So if you take all those kind of policy configurations as given, and we do in our central scenario when we're forecasting outcomes, I wanted to flash up here kind of Aurora's view on how we think wind capacity might evolve in the NEM over time, given those policy configurations. So we'll focus on the central scenario first, which is the top two slides. At the moment, something like 10 gigawatts, give or take, in the NEM. The major constraint at the moment, and we'll get to this in a second, a big part of it is the grid. So both grid connections, system stability, curtailment, and MLS now, probably to a lesser degree, that's slowing growth that might otherwise occur. But material growth over a 25-year time horizon. So in our central scenario, we see the NEM getting to something like 40 gigawatts of onshore wind. A big chunk of that in New South Wales, Queensland, and Victoria, as you'd expect, so split between the states. What does that look like as a percentage of total NEM generation? Basically, you're getting up to 40 to 50%, which is aggressive, given we're at kind of 20 to 25% now, something like that. In our net zero scenario, so this is a more aggressive decarbonisation scenario that kind of fully delivers the various state targets, but also sees a kind of very close to zero carbon NEM by 2050. You can see the growth is more aggressive. You have to build more wind sooner because you're getting out of coal faster. So there's a real jump there to 2030. And instead of getting to 40 gigawatts, it's something like 50 gigawatts. Now, the reason the total demand percentages are a little bit lower is because in that net zero scenario, we also assume much more significant demand growth as the rest of the economy electrifies. I think the challenge with this kind of forecasting is there's just so much that goes into it. I think the demand piece is a really big part of this. It's often under discussed. So, for example, with the Victorian offshore wind plans, I think 9 gigawatts looks like a sensible target if you think the Loyangs are closed in the early 2030s and you think demand is going to do something like double, as AEMO models in a lot of their scenarios. 9 gigawatts, may be more than Victoria requires if either of those coal closures or demand increases don't eventuate. So a lot going on beneath these scenarios, but this is kind of, I suppose, Aurora's house view on what we see onshore wind doing over the next 20 or 30 years. It is worth touching on some of the challenges, some of which are related to policy, but there are a variety of factors at play. We've talked a little bit already about what's happening to LGCs post 2030 and REGOs replacing them over time. Clearly major issues around planning lead times for transmission, but also then the social license for onshore transmission as well. And then policy uncertainty around transmission. So New South Wales' RES approach, instead of the existing open access regime and the Energy Security Board looking at different transition access reform options. There's also just your standard kind of market uncertainties. So when you get to very high levels of wind penetration, as we see in some of Aurora's forecasts, And the UK is already starting to experience this. When it's windy, the chances are the price is going to be significantly lower because wind makes up a bigger part of your supply stack. So price cannibalization, how will that play out? We've seen a lot of it in solar in this country. So the duck curve, negative prices during the middle of the day. Wind hasn't seen it to the same degree. But again, we're kind of at the start of this journey. And when you're getting up to 50% of demand being met by wind, price cannibalization will become a more material issue. I think the most salient concern for wind developers at the moment, aside from the grid, is obviously the capex increases that are being seen globally, not just in Australia, as well as rising interest rates and rising cost of debt. So that certainly squeezes margins or requires higher PPAs or more incentives from government, whatever it might be, to deliver new capacity. I'd say there is growing demand for firm clean power, and wind in particular will play a material role. Neoen, we'll get to this in a second, has been at the forefront of this with their clean PPA with BHP that's anchored around a wind asset, but also supporting battery and a bit of solar as well. So certainly demand for wind PPAs is high at the moment. The prices are much higher than they were a year ago. I won't run through the grid challenges in detail, but the standard things that many of the people on this line will be familiar with: MLFs, which I'll touch on in a second, grid curtailment, particularly in more remote parts of the NEM, and then the lengthy grid connection process that a number of wind participants have had to contend with. On the MLF front, I think there was more concern around MLFs. My sense was that, a couple of years ago, that, market participants have got better about modeling MLFs and smarter about grid selection choices. And a lot of it has been solar that's been punished most heavily by MLFs. But you can just see some data here. This is MLFs over the last 3 or 4 years. And there's a number of wind assets that have seen material reductions in their MLFs as one manifestation of the grid challenges. And again, without the timely delivery of additional transmission, as the grid becomes more congested, these issues may bite for other assets, or bite more for assets that are already experiencing lower MLFs. I wanted to touch on this briefly. Again, it's not directly on policy, but I do think with the rise of a variety of policy interventions and an increasingly material role, particularly for state governments, in determining supply and the mix of supply, there are a number of innovative players out there who are looking at ways to structure portfolios to minimize risk and maximize returns. Aurora's done a lot of work on the space for both utilities and the bigger, more sophisticated developers. And this chart in some ways summarizes that work. So it's applying portfolio theory that you often see in the stock market, equity portfolio design, but applying it to renewable generation assets. And what we've tried to say here is, for a given level of risk, what is the maximum level of return you can achieve? So if, for example, you have an entirely wind-based portfolio, you can achieve a certain level of return for risk, and that's marked by those blue dots there. And there are different types of portfolio construction. You can see on the left-hand side of the bottom chart that deliver potentially lower returns, but also lower risk. As you move to the right-hand side of that bottom left-hand chart, you can see a more concentrated portfolio that delivers potentially higher returns, but will be more volatile across different scenarios and weather years. By inserting some solar into the portfolio, about 20%, you can mitigate risk to some degree. So you move your efficient frontier out. I think what we're seeing the more sophisticated players do, the likes of Iberdrola, Neoen, and the gentailers, obviously, is introducing firming or flexible capacity into renewable portfolios to create genuinely diversified portfolios that achieve a higher level of return for a given level of risk. So you can see in these portfolios, there's a mix of firming options here: 8-hour batteries in SA or Queensland, or 2-hour batteries in SA, but of course, a number of different portfolios that can be designed. And much more than just solar, those assets materially move out the risk return profile. So I think as we're focused on policy and the various policy announcements, and as I said, the increasing role of governments in determining the generation mix and the timing of entry of the generation mix, there are still a lot of players doing very smart things in the market to build these diversified portfolios. I might finish up there. Hopefully helpful as a platform discussion. There's a terrific set of speakers coming up. A big thank you for your time, everyone.
Okay, hold on, Mr. Hugo. Yes. I got some question from the audience with suggestion and want to speak some very simple question to you. You can just answer it very simply. So the first one is, do you think Australia wind projects are being developed at the pace they are required for the current scenario?
So no, basically, if you take the targets that state and federal governments have set very literally, and you assume a reasonable amount of demand growth for electrification for the rest of the industry, you know, Australia is doing well, but it's not on track. But again, Australia is certainly not unique. Really, it's probably just the United Kingdom, California, and some of the European countries that are, you know, genuinely on track to deliver a zero carbon electricity system by 2040, which allows the rest of the economy to decarbonize as well. To some degree, you know, that has been a product of the policy inertia of the last decade in this space. That those things are changing, led by the states and Minister Kean in particular. So there's significant cause for optimism. We can accelerate. I think the supply chain challenges and the cost increases 30–40% we're hearing for batteries and wind are going to play a role as well and make it harder over the next 3 or 4 years. So there are both tailwind and headwinds, but no, we're probably not on track at the moment.
Great. We also have the second one. So this question is, how long, best and the worst case, until we have the green wind electricians from the green windy farms?
So can you pick up the question? I'm not quite sure I understand it.
So how long, the best or worst case, until we have the green windy electricians from the green windy farms?
I think it's a question about the kind of skilled labor required to deliver these assets, and that certainly is going to be one of the bottlenecks involved. I know the Queensland plan puts that front and centre. The Vics are working on that as well. Minister Kean, New South Wales government. So the states are keenly aware of the labour shortages they are going to create by building out at these rates. I think they will ameliorate them, but you know, the market's dynamic. I'm sure wages will rise and people will move into these industries, which is good news for the green economy.
Okay, so one more. I got a question from the QA folks, so from the audience. So this Mr. from name's Joan Lin. So he said, so how does the proposed Victorian SEC 2.0 impact the Aero's modeling?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, I mean, the technical modeling answer is sophisticated models like Aurora's, but you know, there are others out there. AEMO does a ripping job with the integrated system plan. They're designed to build lowest system cost energy systems based on a set of inputs. We are moving to a world though where, you know, through various interventions, not just the Victorians, that policymakers want more guardrails on the energy transition. They want to be confident they can secure security of supply. And for whatever reason, right or wrong, there's just been a kind of undermining in the confidence that the volatile 15K price cap wholesale market can deliver that. And so to some degree, modelling exercises like Aurora are more about tracking government announcements and exogenously building that capacity into our models, where we are confident there is the funding and transmission and a range of other factors for those plants to be delivered. So it does change the nature of our modelling exercises. AEMO does this, so it takes all these government targets very literally. and creates modelled outcomes based on that. We try and take a more nuanced approach where we build capacity we're confident it's going to get delivered, but we don't necessarily take everything governments say entirely literally until we see them at least partly deliver on it. So there are different approaches to this, but it certainly changes the nature of the modelling exercise and changes the underlying nature of the NEM as well. As I said, Tim Nelson and others have written at great length about the distortions in wholesale price and contracts that we are creating through some of these state-based programs.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Hugo. Yeah, thank you. That's all I think. Yeah. So
thank you.
Yeah. So of course, according to the time issue, so we can't answer. I got a lot of questions want to speak to Ms. Hugo, but we can put on our website to answer your guys' question, and also remind some questions suitable for you for the next presentation is suitable to answer it. So thank you, Ms. Hugo, for the excellent opinion, and here the last policy from the offshore wind. So next, let's welcome to Mr. Matt. He's the partner of New Energy Lead, Hamilton Locke.
Good afternoon. Let me share my screen. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
It's a screen within your notes. It's not the.
It is too.
Yes.
It is too.
You got 2 screen or 3, Matt?
Yeah, it's all right. And do it this way. We might just go with this if that's okay.
Yeah.
So good afternoon, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you today about offshore wind developments in Australia. And thank you to Hugo for a very interesting presentation around wind
Sorry,
more
Mr.
broadly.
Do you mind? We can do the PowerPoint for you. So
Sure,
the
no
audience can
problems.
say it really clearly. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yes, if you want to move on the next slide, just say it, so we can help you to move on to the next slide.
Thank you very much, Ryan. So my name is Matt Baumgurtel. I lead the new energy team at Hamilton Locke. I'm joined by a number of my colleagues today, in particular, a shout out to Megan Chow, who helped prepare this presentation today. Next slide, please. I've been asked to speak today around offshore wind development and the regulatory process and regulatory frameworks that exist in Australia. What I would say off the top is that this is new in Australia. The regulatory process and the regulatory regime has only been implemented last year with a change in government. The most important part of that is offshore wind requires federal government approval. We're talking about accessing international waters. It also requires state approvals and state, because you're obviously bringing that power back on shore. Today we'll cover the regulatory framework at state and federal framework, some key challenges. We'll touch on some comparisons with other countries, and some more broader considerations in particular in relation to FIRB, and other considerations for investors. We'll also touch on some of the opportunities that we're seeing in the market for integration of offshore wind into energy storage and also into hydrogen, green hydrogen. Next slide, please. And again, perfect. So I think everyone's probably across the opportunity for offshore wind. The IEA says that it's one of the big three. We've touched on the opportunity to produce green hydrogen offshore, and that's the electrolysis of salt water. And we're seeing more and more technological advancement in that space. We're seeing that operate here, in particular, in Australia, with different technologies being developed by different universities here, but some very exciting things going on there. Australia has a great offshore wind resource. We'll hear more about that later, I'm sure, but Tasmania, Bass Strait, New South Wales, offshore New South Wales, and to a lesser extent, Queensland, and we'll come to that in a moment. There is funding floating around, bad pun, from both federal and state governments. There is a bit of a competition between the states at the moment, like we have seen renewables generally. But what we will need for offshore wind is cooperation between the federal government and the states. Next slide, please. So a snapshot of where we're up to. So June last year, we finally had the Act pass. We've had various funding programs from the state and the feds. In particular, October last year, the Rewiring the Nation plan. But most importantly, we saw the regulations for offshore wind come in November last year, and that has really put the meat on the bone for the legislation. And that's going to outline the process that I'll set out today. Next slide, please. Idea here is to give a very brief snapshot as to the current state of play across all the states and territories. This is in no way comprehensive, but to give you a feel for what's going on. On the East Coast, we're seeing huge developments onshore wind. In New South Wales, we are seeing enormous opportunities offshore, and that's offshore Newcastle in the north, offshore south in the Hunter and Newcastle. We're seeing development in the off the south coast, and we're also seeing, as you come down further and the wind resource gets stronger, an enormous amount of opportunity in Victoria. I don't want to touch on, well, these are all statistics that have been previously noted, but 9 gigawatts of offshore capacity is an enormous amount of capacity. That's effectively a coal fleet. Lots of jobs, lots of investment, big opportunity. It's also where we've seen some of the biggest wind players arrive. Star of the South sits in the Bight, in the Great Australian Bight. But before we get there, Tasmania has an enormous offshore wind capability. You can see there that the wind from the west, the roaring 40s, whacks straight into the side of Tasmania. Some big opportunities for offshore wind there, in particular because the west of Tasmania has a very high environmental value, and it's quite difficult to build onshore wind in the west, but offshore enormous opportunities. South Australia, again, enormous amount of wind already existing in South Australia. The greatest challenge for South Australia is its interconnectedness, and we've heard about some of the transmission programs that are currently on foot, which will open up opportunities for offshore wind in South Australia. Project Energy Connect is probably the one that everyone is familiar with, but there are others, including the links back into Victoria. In Western Australia, where we're seeing some large wind developments in the north and in the south, so around Esperance. Again, offshore in Western Australia is coming along. And the Northern Territory, we're all probably familiar with the Sun Cable project that continues to push forward, but not as an offshore project. It's an onshore project. Next slide, please. So The Offshore Electricity Infrastructure Act 2021. This is the federal government, the federal legislation. There are a number of challenges with this legislation, a number of challenges with the regulations, but let's just set them out in broad brushes. So essentially what happens is the minister declares an area. We've seen some areas already declared. That then opens up a process whereby applicants can apply for a feasibility license and a commercial license. Those are the, these are the license application fees. So this is a big game, 300,000, 350. That gives you, fundamentally, that gives you 7 years to work out whether a project is feasible. And with a commercial license, a 40-year project life. You'll also need a transmission and infrastructure license to get your power back on shore. That requires, and that this is on top of what will be required for the purposes of state approvals and TNSP, or network service provider generally, access. The research and demonstration license is it's not clear how this will be used, given its relatively short term of 10 years. But it is a bit, how to put it, it's a simpler process, much simpler. But a project, in my view, is not going to be viable if it only has a 10-year license. There is the opportunity to convert a demonstration license into a commercial license, and that may be how this is used. But again, this will be in the detail. Working down the slide, the merit criteria are the criteria you need to meet, but the minister does have significant discretion. The big one there is technical and financial capability to carry out the project. In summary, the minister is looking for projects with partners in those projects that have done it before. So anyone from the UK, and we'll come back, UK, China, anywhere that, the Nordic countries, anywhere that has done offshore wind before, the US as well, the minister is looking for that confidence. Likely viability of the project, this really comes down to sea conditions as well as the ability to connect the project and where it's going to connect into. The suitability of the applicant to hold a license is pretty much a standard criteria across all electricity regulation in Australia, but they will dig into corporate governance, particularly in relation to joint ventures, and national interest, the all-encompassing, do we like it or not? Again, a similar concept to that of the Foreign Investment Board, Foreign Investment Review Board approval. There are a number of other sort of pieces that sit in this that the minister is interested in understanding. The financial security piece, they want to see the project will proceed and won't create an environmental eyesore if it doesn't proceed. That comes back into the management plan as well, WHS. All these things, environmental requirements, operational plans, consultation with community, in particular traditional owners, but also local community more broadly. Then they also want to understand what the decommissioning cost is going to be, and that's something that is at the moment a bit of a vexed issue for developers. Developers are struggling to put a finger on how much it's going to cost to build it, let alone take it down in 40 years' time. What is relevant is to note that all the other permitting and approvals processes also apply. EPBC, you'll need a DA, you'll need cultural heritage, you'll need all of those pieces that need to come on top. This is a layer of regulatory approval process on top of an existing wind project. Just to note finally there, the post-approval and license. So you've got there are some significant reporting obligations in relation to compliance with your license. This is not unusual and mirrors in some respects the oil and gas regulation in Australia. A lot of this process has been drawn from, and it's probably something else to note, a lot of this process has been drawn from oil and gas regulation, offshore oil and gas regulation, which is a good thing. It's a heavily regulated area. It does give us some color as to what's going to be required. Next slide, please. So the regulatory framework went through a consultation process. I've tried to give a broad brush summary of some of the issues with the regulatory process that have been identified. The criteria such as a route to market to make the project viable. To obtain a license, you've got to show that there's a market for the electricity. That's an interesting concept to work through. How do you prove your project is viable without a license? So that's a challenge. We're yet to see how the minister will interpret that. There's a broad discretion as for the minister, as previously outlined. That's arguably a good thing. It shouldn't be formulaic, but equally it does create regulatory uncertainty as to whether a license will, you'll receive a license. The most important way, or the easiest way to bottom that out, is to engage early with the minister and the department. And in our experience, they are very receptive to soft sounding in relation to your project. So I'd advise to do that. The real one of the key issues is the minister determines the viability of the areas that are open to tender, open to licensing. That in itself limits the areas. So whether that's by design or by accident, other offshore areas that are potentially open to and would be good for offshore wind, there's no process by which proponents can propose those areas. It's a reactive, the area becomes open. That's a little bit different to offshore oil and gas, where prospecting effectively works the other way. But I suspect what will happen is the minister will be open to applications for other areas on sort of a soft basis. One of the key challenges for investors or for developers looking for investment is that there is not a clear pathway for the transferability or change in control of a licensee. We're talking about very large projects with significant capex. It is unlikely that a developer today will be able to develop that project all the way to financial close. They will need to bring in partners, and those partners will have deep pockets. It is not clear how the minister will approach that, and the minister is given significant discretion in that regard. Next slide, please. So some of the key challenges of the regulatory process, and we'll touch on these a little bit later as well in terms of what are the opportunities we're seeing. There appears to be some challenges with the way that offshore wind projects will hook into the grid and obtaining grid approval. The opportunity to store the energy, whether that be in pumped hydro or in hydrogen, is very interesting, and we're seeing proponents team up their projects, team them up with pumped hydro projects and team them up with hydrogen projects. The construction and maintenance, the capex and opex requirements are a key challenge to large projects, and that's why we'll need partners across this. Getting the people and the equipment to, the people to build it and maintain it, and the equipment required to Australia, it's a long way from anywhere else. It's unlikely that the vast majority of this equipment will be made in Australia. It's most likely to be made in other industrial hubs, and on that basis, we'll need to get it here. With the lack of deep port infrastructure is significant and needs to be built out. If you're developing these projects, you need to be looking for deep water ports to bring your equipment in on. And the economic feasibility of these projects continuously changes because of capex requirements. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit of a comparison across other countries, and then I want to come back to some of the challenges in Australia. You can see here, if the slide can be zoomed a touch, the dominant developer of offshore wind projects is China, with the UK right in behind. Netherlands catching up quickly. France has moved very quickly recently, and we'll come to that in the next slide. And then in Europe across other parts. The most projects There are a lot of projects in the Asia Pacific region where we are very busy offshore Korea and offshore Japan, because those markets have moved faster. I do think that Australia will though catch up. Next slide, please. Just a little bit more on the comparison, just to give you some numbers. 43.3 gigawatts in a new project to be built in Taiwan Straits. Enormous. 830 gigawatts as of 2021. That's an enormous amount of energy. UK sort of comes in behind at 12.7 gigawatts, but a very large proportion of the UK electricity consumption. Netherlands, the French and the Japanese in behind. Sorry, thank you. I think the French are coming. The French are coming quickly, and Japan has stolen the march. Korea is not on this list, but also coming very, very quickly. We're also seeing big developments in Vietnam. Next slide, please. Some broad observations here in relation to what do investors need to consider. Investors need to consider FIRB. FIRB is and we know Treasury, the federal government, the federal Treasury, have a particular interest in offshore wind developments. It is strategic. We are talking about large infrastructure being built on the coast. In our current political and security framework position in the world, developments in those parts of Australia are highly sensitive, highly sensitive. So foreign investment approvals and generally federal government stakeholder engagement is critical to these projects. Probably the one that's been in the news is Equinor and Ocean X as a case example. Next slide, please. I think that's so. I wanted to touch on a couple of other observations that we're seeing in the market. The first is because of the huge amount of generation, the need to store some of that electricity for consumption at a different time. So generation shifting. What we're seeing is offshore wind developers team up with pumped hydro developers to create a behind the meter connection to store that energy. The gigawatts line up in some respects. If you've got a 6 gigawatt wind farm, you probably need a 3 gigawatt pumped hydro project, and they exist, particularly in New South Wales. So we're seeing that as a key part of developing an offshore wind project, is having a clear route to market and a clear way to store your energy. And the other that we're seeing probably more recently, when I say recently in the last couple of months, is green hydrogen being produced offshore and the cracking or electrolysis of salt water. And the technology around that is nascent, don't get me wrong, but it has moved very, very quickly in the period of, I'd say, 12 months. We're seeing that technology being developed in universities in Australia, but also around the world, most notably in China. So I would leave on this note. I'm very happy to take questions on this process, but we're seeing those two technological advancements, the teaming up of offshore wind with pumped hydro, and the technology to crack and create hydrogen from seawater, as critical pieces of critical parts of the opportunity for offshore wind in Australia. If we're going okay on time, I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Matt. It's very interesting topic and a very interesting presentation. So I got a lot of questions from the audience. So the first one is from the Miss Zhang, and he said, so where Australian government requires a local connect in the offshore wind projects. So what do you think?
Yet to be seen. I think local content will be driven by the states more than the federal government. We can draw analogies with the local content requirements of the VRET and the VRET 2 program in Victoria, where local content is a significant requirement. To be honest, I can't see us meeting any of our targets with significant local content requirements. We just don't have the manufacturing capability. But that said, the opportunity to retask what is a significant offshore oil and gas skill set we have in Australia is there. So I can see a redeployment of that infrastructure and those skills, those people and those skills into offshore wind.
Okay, thank you. So the next one is from the Ms. Kyle and his side. So have you reviewed oversized regulatory policy and advocate any of the Pacifics, policies for the Australian markets and the make transmos?
Sorry, I could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. So have you reviewed overseas regulatory policies and advocate any of their
Yes. So the comparison between the Australian regulatory regime and others, Japanese and Korean in particular, is there. They are very different markets, very different interconnected electricity generation markets. Probably the one that's most interesting is what Vietnam are doing. A very relatively simple process, but state controlled, completely state controlled. So in the Australian context, it is a free market with licenses being granted to licensees. I think that there will be some hesitation to government direct and pick winners in Australia. But that said, I can see the government wanting to see regular progress. They're not going to let developers sit on projects for a long time or sit on licenses for a long time. They will open up the area again. And I think that's a key. That's clearly what the reporting requirements are driven towards. And there is the power of the minister to revoke a license if they do not see that the licensee is progressing with the project at sufficient pace.
Okay, thanks. The last question. So has there been any further thinking about interface between the states and Commonwealth waters and the OEI Act, especially the management plans?
Yes, there is cooperation between the states and the federal government. Each project will need to manage both of those stakeholders closely. The challenge, the challenge is a political one in some respects, but in other respects, it is purely a bureaucratic challenge. You've got international waters, you've got local waters, you've got onshore communities. There are lots of stakeholders. All offshore wind does is add another layer to that. It's navigable, and in some respects, we're seeing the states not step back, but wait for developers and proponents to obtain their federal license before really engaging. So I think we'll see the next wave once those licenses have been granted.
Okay, thanks. So, Mr. Matt, could you do my favor? Because you have very interesting topics. So I got a huge question from the Q&A box. You can see it under the screen. So could you stay a bit a long time in there so you can answer the question using you can type the answers
Sure.
in the Q&A box. Thank you.
No problems.
Yes. So thank you, Mr. Matt's memorable speech. Everybody knows the floating and fixing has always been challenging in the offshore wind. So the GHD, the one of the world's leading offshore wind energy companies, brought to you the hottest topic at the moment, the floating winds. So let's move into stage with Ms. Taraz.
Thank you. Can I just confirm you can see my presentation and you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and I've got 20 minutes, right?
Yeah, we can see it.
Wonderful. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to Hugo and Matt for your insights and great presentations. Very interesting. My name is Taraz Saba, and I'm a Senior Technical Director and Power Generation Service Line for APAC in GHT. I've been involved with the industry for the past 3 decades, and it's my pleasure to share some insights on floating offshore wind developments with you here. As we are meeting today online in various parts of the country, in the spirit of reconciliation, I would like to begin my presentation by acknowledging Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the traditional custodians of the land, water, and sky throughout Australia on which we do business. I recognize their strength, diversity, resilience, spiritual qualities, and deep connections to country. I would also like to pay my respect to elders, both past, present, and emerging. Here is a quick overview of my presentation. Just with your permission, I'll just take a few seconds to introduce GHD. So GHD is an international multidisciplinary engineering services company. It was founded as a private practice in Melbourne, 1928. Currently, we have over 11,000 employees working in over 200 offices worldwide. Our global footprints extend to 5 continents and nearly 114 countries. We are involved in offshore projects in Australia, New Zealand, Philippines, the UK, and North America. We offer a wide range of integrated services across the renewable projects, including origination initiatives, where GHG is prepared to put some skin in the game at the very start of the project, which means we could work with you as a partner to mitigate the initial development risks. So let's get into our main topic, which is floating offshore wind. And to start with, what is floating offshore wind? It's pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Instead of putting a wind turbine on a fixed foundation in the sea, we attach it to a structure that floats in the water. This structure is anchored to the seabed to stop it from drifting in, for instance, into a beach or a shipping lane. Today's floating wind designs use standard offshore turbines, export cables, and balance of plant materials. The key difference between floating and fixed foundation offshore wind is that the latter is limited to water depths of up to around 50 to 60 meters. For floating, with current design concepts, we could go to water depths of up to 150 to 200 meters. Several foundation designs are considered in floating offshore wind. As you can see in this slide, there are tension leg, barge, semi-submersible, and spar floating. Each has its own pros and cons and really depends on the water depth, seabed and geology, ocean currents, port fabrication capacity, and many other factors. There are a great deal of experience and expertise that exist from the oil and gas industries that are now being utilized in offshore wind. Matt touched on that. For instance, Equinor, who has recently entered in Australian market and has teamed up with OceanX. So OceanX is one of the local offshore wind developers, use its experience in the oil and gas to base its pioneering high wind floating offshore wind on a spar buoy design that relies on gravity for stability. Incidentally, this was the very first large-scale floating wind farm in the world. So in the Australian context, initial developers currently, the signals point to semi-submersible foundation types. This is suitable for shallower waters, provides simpler implementation in broad weather installations. Although critics note that the large size of the structure could restrict maneuverability in ports. So in terms of why floating offshore wind, over 80% of the world's offshore wind resource potential lies in water depths deeper than 60 meters, meaning that as we continue our efforts to decarbonize, we must look for opportunities in these deeper waters. There has been a steady development of floating foundation technologies in recent years throughout the world, and this has created many more options, not only for the identification of projects that were previously inaccessible, but also for the progression of locally based technologies and workforces. Majority of current wind generation is largely onshore. However, social licensing issues, particularly near shore and new onshore wind developments, and less availability of low depth waters for fixed foundation, has resulted in a growing momentum to create a situation for floating offshore wind. Floating wind turbines give access to abundant wind resources over deep water, several times as much ocean surface space compared with bottom fixed wind, and also offer less potential to disturb seabed marine life. This increases flexibility in site selection, including the possibility to target areas with much higher wind resource and those with lower social and environmental impact. Let's look at the offshore wind resources and areas in Australia. This slide shows water depth of the regions where we know the wind resource is most suitable for offshore wind generations, pretty much southern shorelines and in the east and around Western Australia. There are several areas in Bass Strait, of course, in Victoria that lend themselves to fixed foundation offshore wind projects, primarily for having less than 60-meter water depth. So in that slide, all the dark blue are more than 60-meter depth. However, for New South Wales in contrast, and there are hardly any suitable areas unless you go very close to the shoreline. I mean, less than 5 kilometers. But then offshore wind loses its advantage over land-based renewable technologies. So for New South Wales, it is very likely that all our offshore wind projects would be of floating foundation type. This has already been confirmed by developers such as Equinor Oceanics, where they have announced floating offshore wind projects such as Illawarra. For Victoria, the initial round of projects would most likely utilize fixed foundation type technologies, as we have seen for well-progressed projects such as Star of the South. However, there are areas in Victoria and within those declared zones that they need floating foundations. We'll talk about it a bit more. So in terms of the global picture status of floating offshore wind, currently less than 200 megawatt of floating offshore wind projects in operation, compared with over 50,000 megawatts for fixed foundations. In 2021, Matt touched on this as well, China commissioned nearly 14,000 gigawatt. Of course, it was all fixed wind. This was more capacity in 1 year than the entire world installed in any single previous year. Quite amazing. 3 floating offshore wind projects came online in 2021, totaling around 57 megawatts of new capacity. The largest floating offshore wind project to date is in Scotland. It's a 48 megawatt Kean offshore wind project. A 5.5 megawatt floating demonstration project also began operation in China, and there was another 3.6 megawatt demonstration project in Norway. In early 2022, there have been 2 other notable projects, a 2 megawatt demonstration floating project in Spain, and the first floating wind turbine for the 88 megawatt high wind Tampen project in Norway was assembled later in 2022. The Tampen project, by the way, by Equinor, when complete, will be the largest floating wind project in the world. It is noted that Equinor also developed the world's first commercial scale floating offshore wind in Scotland. It's been operational since 2017. So in summary, we had about 124 megawatts of installed offshore wind by 2021. Based on 5 independent studies, I've shown it on this graph here on the screen, it is expected around 10 to 11 gigawatts will be installed by 2030. This is worldwide. 7,200 gigawatts by 2040, and 2050 gigawatt plus by 2050. Globally, total offshore wind installed capacity is expected for to reach around 2,000 gigawatts by 2050. For floating offshore wind, it is anticipated to generate around 15% of all offshore wind energy by then. So it has a significant potential. So in terms of floating offshore projects in Australian context, as we saw in my previous slides, coastal regions such as New South Wales could only accommodate offshore wind with floating foundation technologies. In Victoria also, there are areas within the declared offshore wind zones that would potentially utilize floating foundations. This slide shows the spread of all offshore wind projects that have been announced by various developers and the spread between floating and fixed foundations. As you can see, over 40% of the proposed sites in Australia and nearly 30% of the sites in Victoria will be using floating foundation designs. Projects in all other states that are being proposed will be fixed as far as we know. Need to note these percentages are purely based on the project data that has been released by the proponents, and we know some of these numbers are quite high. Obviously, it is unlikely all these proposed projects will be built. However, the proportion of fixed versus floating, I believe, is expected to be representative of what is likely to happen in the near future. So, for instance, for the Victorian declared zones, as we know, offshore wind zones were declared in Bass Straits of Gippsland. Victoria in late January, this was in late January, and earlier in 2021, the Victorian government set ambitious targets of 9 gigawatts of offshore wind generation installed by 2040. So it was 2 gigawatts by 2032, 4 gigawatts by 2035, and 9 by 2040. As it was mentioned before, this target, first of its kind in the Pacific region, really ignited and kickstarted a flurry of offshore wind activities in Australia. So full credit to our regulators, policymakers, and all my offshore wind colleagues in Australia. We also heard that the New South Wales government has commissioned a detailed study of assessing offshore wind implementation potential in the state. In the current energy transition phase that we are in, and as all states and territories are endeavoring towards our goal of reaching net zero emissions targets by 2050 or 2045, I do strongly believe New South Wales government will set its offshore wind generation targets not too far from what the Victorian government did. And I, to be frank, will be surprised if the targets are less ambitious than Victoria. So in terms of, for Australia, I think Australia among US, China, Japan, South Korea are those countries with high potential for floating offshore wind. The future trajectory and global growth of floating offshore wind depends to a large extent on what is going to happen in the next in this decade, in particular in the next 5 years. Within the second half of the 2020s, commercial scale floating offshore wind deployment is poised to accelerate in the UK, France, South Korea, Japan, and Norway. Several new floating offshore wind projects will also emerge in late this decade. And these are, as we know, definitely in Australia, will include other countries such as Spain, Portugal, United States, and Taiwan. So really the current projections that nearly 40% of the proposed offshore wind projects in Australia could be floating, and the fact that all sites in New South Wales will be using floating foundations highlight Australia's role and influence in fast forwarding floating offshore wind developments in the APAC region, and in fact in worldwide. So Australia is poised, in my opinion, to have a quite significant role in floating offshore wind developments in the global scene. When considering hydrogen and power to X, that part of floating, the part that floating offshore wind is going to play will become extra important for Australia. Now let's touch on a bit about the cost and levelized cost of electricity trends. Let's consider the capex for offshore wind in Australia. Current forecast, and it is a forecast, but it's always very difficult. But a number of studies point and suggest that capex for an offshore wind with fixed foundation, with completion dates around 2028, towards the end of this decade, is nearly twice as much as a typical onshore wind farm without any support from the government. And for a floating offshore wind, this figure could even be higher by 30 to 50. So this is obviously a general rule of thumb and depends on many different factors that could change the assumption significantly. However, most factors suggest that, most forecasts suggest that we see noticeable reductions in the capex and hence the levelized cost of electricity, LCOE, for both fixed and floating offshore wind foundations. So for floating, although it's still in its very early stage and there are very few operational floating wind turbines, and hence the LCOE for this technology is currently very high. As you can see for these graphs, it's all indication is going to come down. For this technology to scale faster, it is paramount that the LCOE is reduced as much and as quickly as possible. This drop depends on a number of factors, such as cumulative installed capacity, economy of scale, serial manufacturing, supply chain and coordinations, and many more. There are several studies that have attempted to forecast floating offshore wind cost trends to 2035 and beyond. So to compare Australian offshore wind industry, I think US is a good candidate, in my opinion, although they are a couple of years ahead of us. Nevertheless, with recent developments in the policy and regulatory framework in here, we are catching up. So for the US, the LCOE for a floating offshore wind project is estimated to decline from approximately around 200 megawatt in 2021 to between $60 to $120 per megawatt hour by 2030. These are US dollars, by the way. So as you can see in this slide, these estimates assume commercial scale floating offshore wind and learning curve benefits that combines with the maturity of the industry. I've got a few factors in there that suggest how, that it will contribute to bringing the cost down. So translating these LCOE figures to the Australian context, I think we can expect the floating offshore wind LCOE to reduce well below $100 per megawatt hour from 2030 and onwards. And it's a general expectation in the industry by 2050, the LCOE for floating offshore wind will drop below Australian $50 per megawatt hour. Of course, these are all forecasts, and we know how accurate they could be. So in terms of turbines, that they are being used and we'll see them being used in Australia in near future. By the time our first offshore wind projects are ready to be installed, we will have turbines in the order of 14 to 15 megawatt capacity or larger, being readily available. Vestas B236 15 megawatt prototype wind turbine has been installed and operating at a testing site in Denmark. GE Halide machine also been operating at this test site for nearly 3 years and is going through his certification for being certified at nearly 15 megawatt. So in conclusion, Australia is among high potential markets in the world for floating offshore wind. Since all offshore wind sites in New South Wales are floating type, we expect to see serious project development activities by 2025-ish and project deliveries towards the end of this decade. It's a little bit ambitious, but I think there are a lot of developers talking that kind of time frame. LCOE for floating offshore wind is expected to drop below $100 megawatt hour by 2035 and below Australian $50 megawatt hour or lower by 2050. Globally, all projections indicate that at least 10 gigawatt of floating offshore wind by 2030 and 70 to 100 gigawatts by 2040. And finally, floating offshore wind is expected to generate nearly 15% of all offshore wind energy by 2050. I think that's the last slide. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Taraz. There I have this few questions.
Sure.
So yeah, first one is what are some of the ideas to overcome the supply chain? These advantages Australian currently face is not only for the offshore wind, it means for the whole wind industry. What do you think about it?
I think if I understand correctly, it's about supply chain question. Obviously, that one of the advantages that, and those, as was mentioned before, those numbers are 2 gigawatts or 9 gigawatts. It's a massive amount of energy, and hence the infrastructure needs to support it. So supply chain will be a huge challenge to get those projects up and running. And of course, Australia being a country with a lot of steel and having resources to be able to generate green steel, for instance, the potentials are there to supply some of the supply chain, but realistic, honestly, to get the first project up and running, we will be having significant challenges of from the supply chain and being able to provide support for those projects. And because we never built offshore wind, as Matt said, there's a lot of learnings from oil and gas, but those installation barges and vessels, we don't have them. We have to bring them in. So there are a lot of challenges lying ahead.
Okay. Thanks, Mr. Taraz. The other question from Mr. Cal, he said, the floating wind will see the terminus further out to sea. So at what distance do you see the AC/DC transferring to the HVDC?
I think that's a bit beyond. I'm a mechanical engineer, sorry. So probably I can answer that. I can take it on notice and come back. But I suppose what we are seeing from the UK and as well, that the high voltage HVDC is being used, and in terms of the distances, I really don't know. But for instance, New South Wales, we are looking a distance as a fair bit of distance from the shoreline. So innovations in reticulation, bringing those powers to the shoreline is going to be paramount and fundamental.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Taraz. Yeah, thank you. So thank you to Ms. Taraz for his wonderful speech. So as we all know, the Gippsland is the first wave to the offshore wind in Australia and the demonstration area of the Australian wind power. So it will be the hot topic to make Gippsland global leader in the wind power. So let's welcome today's final section, Leaders Panel. How can industry pioneer Gippsland as a world-leading offshore wind demonstration zone? So let me introduce today's moderator, Ms. Sally. She's the partner commercial advisory and transactions from the KPMGs. Hello, Mrs. Sally. Could you hear me, Mrs. Sally? Just hold on a minute. Mrs. Sally is on the way.
You can see her.
So we assist Mrs. Sally with the voice issue. So Just purchase all the audience, just waiting a moment.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, great. Apologies about that. I couldn't understand why it was
Well, I
doing
can.
it.
I'm
But
not sure the rest. I think everybody
okay.
else.
Can someone confirm if we're live?
Yes.
Okay, great. Well, apologies about that technical issue, everyone. Thanks very much for joining this panel. It is my pleasure to host this conversation, and we're really delighted to have a number of experts, and I'll just introduce them all. So first of all, joining us from AMO Services, or AMO, apologies. Hello, can you hear me? Okay, I'm just going to assume that this is still working. So joining us first from the Australian Energy Market Operator is Miss Nicola Falcon. Thanks very much, Nicola, for joining us. We've also got the CEO of the Latrobe Valley Authority, Chris Buckingham. He's going to be joining us to be talking about local engagement. And also Mr. Nick Sankey, who's Country Manager of Blue Float Energy. I'd like to just raise that we've had, unfortunately, an apology from both Miss Penny Pickett and Mr. Jonathan Smith. Both are being unable to join us due to a family emergency. So it's great to have you all in the panel. All right, I'm going to start by just posing a question. Is that there's been a lot of uncertainty about how offshore wind in Australia is working. We are very lucky to be able to have this opportunity to hear from a few experts before, and it's wonderful to see a presentation from Matt and also a presentation from GHD. I think the first question that I probably want to pose to you all is where do you think offshore wind in Australia is going? And do you think that that we've seen some pretty aggressive targets by all states in terms of what will be the penetration of offshore wind? Let's be good to get around a sense from you all. Maybe I'll start with you, Nick. Is where do you see offshore wind in Australia?
Well, I guess I'm a bit conflicted here because clearly I see it as the key renewable energy technology over the future. We view offshore wind as really the only current technology to really deliver the scale that we require to transition from fossil fuels at the moment. We've got such an opportunity here and such large tracts of sea that are suitable for offshore wind. We just saw in the past presentation a combination of both floating and fixed bottom projects that we see offshore wind really as the key technology that will enable us to build gigawatts of renewables that is required to replace the gigawatts of retiring plant. And in a coordinated manner, we've got the real opportunity now to reconfigure the grid to certain areas to really recreate the Latrobe Valleys and the Hunter Valleys offshore. So we're seeing, I think all renewable energy technologies are important, and diversification of technology is important. So we still see continuance of onshore wind and solar, but the key element of offshore wind is just to really deliver that scale that's required to replace the many gigawatts of retiring coal-fired plant.
Nick, that's really insightful. I might bring you Chris into this. There's been a lot about the Latrobe Valley and what that means. Be interested to hear your views on what it means for Latrobe, but actually what it means broader for all the Australian energy market.
Look, I think what's particularly interesting for the Latrobe Valley and Gippsland is the shift from brown coal-fired power and other traditional forms of energy to renewable energy. And so both economically and culturally, it's a really interesting time. We, on one hand, I think the grieving process is concluded around the closure of brown coal-fired power stations. We now have a fairly clear agenda for that change. And I think people in the region are now looking to what could be through offshore wind, acknowledging Nick's point around the need for diversification and not putting all your eggs in one basket. But I think there's a really skilled workforce in the Trove Valley and Gippsland that would be well positioned to support the transition to renewable energy if they're given the opportunity. And I think this is probably one of the challenges we face as a region, knowing the enormous pressure that government and indeed industry is under to deliver the transition in an energy sense rather than in a regional sense.
And last but not least, Nicola, your opening remarks on this topic.
Yeah, look, mine were actually going to be a little bit similar to Nick's, to be honest, just for listeners who may not necessarily understand the scale of what we need to do here in Australia as we transition to net zero. We've got, well, just over 15 gigawatts of renewable generation in the market today. By 2030, we think we're going to have to triple that. We're going to double it again by 2040 and double it again by 2050. So I think it's definitely not an either or. It's an and. We need to have the development in as many different renewable resource options as possible, and obviously how that will play out and that mix will depend on the economics. But I think it's a really, really important thing to be thinking about and planning for offshore wind being part of that future.
So on planning, let's go to our first topic then. When it comes to some of the social licenses and the skill shortages around here, they're not easy questions, and it's clear from the amount of buzz in the market at the moment that's being generated by the license programs that are, obviously we've got one at the moment in play and 5 more to go. What is the role that you see for the private sector versus the public sector? And perhaps maybe if we can start with around maybe the associated infrastructure. Nicola, I'll go to you first. What do you see as the role of the private versus the public sector role when it comes to being able to deliver this massive mandate for offshore wind?
Yeah, look, we welcome Victorian government's not only their policy announcement, but also their statement of intent to talk about coordination of the transmission and the connection assets that will be required. So I think there needs to be certainly a partnership, public and private, where you can have an ability to sort of see that future and think about the transmission and the common assets that will be needed from a number of different private entities, do it in a coordinated way so that we can actually build the social license. I think that, you mentioned social license in your introduction there as well. I think there's a real risk that if we don't have a coordinated plan, we're going to end up with a spider's web of different connection assets coming onto the system that will actually be of harm for building social license. So having something like the government's policy and a plan to coordinate the transmission to help facilitate the connection of the renewable generation, I think is going to be a really, really important part of it.
Nick, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think just leading on from that, we had a community session down at Seasparrow a couple of months ago, and I'll be honest, I think we probably had more questions about the onshore transmission lines than we did about the offshore infrastructure. So, we like to think that we're developing, offshore infrastructure projects, which we are, but I guess you step inside the eyes and the minds of the community, and down there, it's all about it's all about overhead transmission lines, and how we can work together as developers to try and come up with a solution that minimises the impact on the community and on the environment as well. So I think there's a big role to play here, and there's Victorian state government have already led out with that through VicGrid, saying that they've identified the 2 areas in Gippsland and down near Portland where they see VicGrid as playing a role in coordinating infrastructure so that it's multi-user infrastructure. And I think that's really important that we all work together. AusNet have got their GRES proposal out there as well. And from a blue float perspective, we've been very big advocates of shared infrastructure and utilising common infrastructure. So in what form that is, we very much want to be a part of it. And we think it's just the right solution from a community aspect and for getting social licence. The other key point I wanted to say there is that you've got to remember from a community perspective, when they're looking out at these projects, they don't differentiate between projects. So cumulative impact of a number of projects is a really big issue as well. You know, we can go out there and talk about our specific site and about our specific project, and we're not at liberty to be talking about what other developers may or may not do, but we are very, very cognizant from the community perspective that they will be viewing all these projects as one. They're not differentiating between, developer ABC's turbine to developer XYZ's turbine. So I think there's a real role there for all developers working with the government to work out, within the zones, how can we work communities to allay this kind of this concern about cumulative impact and the combination of a number of projects all being within the one area.
And to bring you, Chris, into this discussion, obviously, this is particularly to the Latrobe community. This first tender is going to be pretty significant, and they're probably a little bit ahead in sort of seeing the effect of what this could mean for them. What's been your take on the social licence and the skill shortage, and how the community has really looked at the Gippsland?
So I think there's a degree of cautious optimism in the region. I think we're still challenged by the scoping process. It's, as to Nicola's point, it is massive. To Nick's point, you're absolutely right. There will be no differentiation between a blue float project as opposed to a Star of the South project in terms of the visual impact on the skyline, and indeed VicGrid and the power lines that will be required to get that energy to the Latrobe Valley will also be viewed as the same project. They won't differentiate between government and industry in terms of the impact on the environment or indeed the job opportunities. So I think the key thing from our point of view is, one, doing our level best to work collaboratively. And I'm talking here as a regional representative from state government, to work collaboratively with the region, with government and indeed industry, to make sure that community leverages the most benefits possible. I think, when we talk about Latrobe Valley and Gippsland, really we are Gippsland. Latrobe Valley, I'll use the technical term, is where the power points are and the extension cords running back into the rest of the grid. But in terms of the impact on our landscape and indeed our community, it's a shared impact. It's also a shared benefit. But that said, people who are going to be surrendering their farms or compromising their landscapes will have a very different view towards offshore wind and renewable energy, as opposed to those that may see multi-generational employment created in their community. And so we have to be really aware of that.
It's really interesting to hear you reflect on that, because when we think about some of the environmental factors that need to be taken into account, obviously we know that yes, it is a shared risk, but perhaps it's a shared benefit, but the risks aren't always evenly distributed in the same way. What are your thoughts then in terms of perhaps how difficult is it going to be for proponents to weave through site selection, notwithstanding obviously that grid's going to play a really big role, and that's kind of a big piece aside. When looking at some of those sites, do you think it's going to be very easy for proponents to pick sites? We've seen them, many of them sort of express public interest to where they want to be positioned in terms of flagging to the market where they want to be. But obviously we know there are many more that have kept quiet. How do you think that's going to go for the Gippsland? Chris, that's questions to you, sorry.
Thanks, Sally. Look, I think in terms of site selection and speculation around who wants what or is playing for what, that's probably out of my bailiwick and one that maybe Nicola and Nick are best placed to answer. But I think I'll reflect on the Gippsland New Energy Conference that was, and this might sound a bit obtuse, but it was held just about in August of last year, where there was a gathering of renewable energy providers, local government, state government, community, business interests. And what I saw was a collective desire for a joined up approach. So best possible outcome for all involved, I think, is probably what we should all be aspiring to do, understanding that industry has to go through a competitive process. But I think there are some shared values that are really important. This is, one out of the box in terms of an opportunity for industry and developers to actually invest in a region that's receptive to renewable energy in a broader sense. So it's how we do this in a responsible way that acknowledges the relatively mature conversations that are occurring within the region and respect those things. The last thing I would suggest to you is that it's so very important that no matter what developers and indeed government decide to do, what pathways are taken, who are selected, that industry and government enter genuine engagement in place. And what I mean by that is not necessarily turning up with a clipboard and doing a Q&A and giving people a rough idea of what you think is going to happen, but it's probably more about demonstrating long-term commitment to the region in place and demonstrating that through the consultation and engagement that the community will see some benefits and that the negative impacts will be ameliorated.
So maybe I'll turn to you, Nicola, to maybe provide some comments on how difficult is it going to be to work through that site selection, given some of the environmental factors, and specifically really interested. I mean, a number of you have now talked about the collaboration. How do you see the collaboration on grid? How's that going to work in line with the site selection process and the way that it's been regulated at the moment?
So at AEMO, and particularly in our role planning in Victoria, we aren't really focused on site selection for generation or anything like that. We're more talking about, planning what type of transmission grid we will need. But having said that, we have certainly getting a lot of experience now on planning and considering the social license, environmental and cultural constraints that you might face as you're looking to build the infrastructure in Victoria. One thing that we're trying to do, and you mentioned sort of the reg process and so forth, we're trying to actually get these considerations brought in earlier in the planning process so that we can start really thinking about the environmental, the land planning, the social impacts of any investment as we're starting planning the locations. Often it's almost done, you kind of have an idea of where you're going to connect in at Latrobe or something like that, and then you try and figure out how to mitigate the risks that might put on environment and so forth. Whereas you can really turn it around if you're starting to think of a broader set of criteria to consider beforehand. And that's a lot of what Victorian government has wanted to do with their Victorian Transmission Investment Framework, is start to actually bring in considerations around the environment and social and cultural impacts at the time of site selection rather than afterwards. Obviously, in terms of investors, where they want to site their offshore wind and where they want to connect in, they'll be basing that on a number of factors. One will be is the best way to connect into the grid and where there might be capacity on the grid. But there's got to be a number of other factors that they're also thinking about when they're looking at the site and impacts.
And Nick, I don't want to put you on the spot. I mean, obviously site selection is a key part of your IP. What are your thoughts about some of the challenges that the proponents are going to have in the way that the regs process has been currently structured?
Yeah, I guess we've up till now we've kind of seen a few different schools of thought on how you select your site and the degree of publicity that you promote. I mean, we've taken a very overt approach. We've explicitly stated our site area, and I guess we kind of we're quite comfortable in doing that, because when you go through the EPBC referral process, then it's all publicly available information anyway. But what we did when we were looking at our sites, that there weren't that many sites actually disclosed when we began our journey, about 18 months ago. But we deliberately didn't overlap other publicly announced sites. And part of that logic is that we do want to see an industry being developed. And I don't think there's any developer out there who just wants to see their project come to market and believes that they can be the only one without any other projects. So when you look at the challenges I think we're getting onto this in a minute, of supply chain and developing ports, creating an industry, training up workforce, getting the right skills, then I don't think it's possible to do that as a single project. So we're actually very favourable in trying to work in an area with other developers. And so when we didn't overlap and others have come in kind of around us, we actually think that that's very positive. And we want to see multiple licenses, and we want to see an industry being developed, because there's no way that we can have one project being successful without the associated infrastructure, supply chains and economies of scale emerging. So I guess we see it as whilst it is a competitive process, it's also quite collaborative, and we've got some great relationships with the other developers in the area, and we intend to maintain them within a competitive environment.
I want to stay with you, Nick, on a topic that you've just brought up, and that is around the supply chains and sort of the role of the associated infrastructure like ports and so on. Do you think that we are doing enough to prepare ourselves for offshore, and what is it that it's going to take for us to be ready to make these projects successful and not awfully delayed or increasingly high on CapEx?
Yeah, I think we're only just now truly understanding the scale of what we're getting ourselves in for here. It's and the more work that we do from a Blueflow perspective, the more we realise what a challenge it is. It's a challenge that we're up for. But are we doing enough work? Well, I think you're just going to see the work beginning to compound and snowball from here. We've been going out quite extensively along the supply chain, talking to various participants who may or may not be involved in the supply chain. And I guess it's become very apparent for us, it's important to realise that all these companies, be they a port, be they a manufacturer, that they need time to invest in their own businesses to make sure that their businesses are ready for the time that we need them. And so they need to be working in advance of us. It's no point in us going through the development phase and reaching FID and then telling the port, okay, you can now spend the next 3 years going through your environmental approvals, undertaking your development so that you're ready for us. We need the infrastructure ready when we hit FID if we're going to be able to reach our timeline. So incredibly important to realise that we do need to work quickly, and we need to give these associated infrastructure projects the confidence that there is going to be an industry there. A port will only invest in their facilities, which at the end of the day will be quite specific to the offshore wind industry, if they've got the confidence that they've got the business there, that they've got a number of projects that will be utilising the port that provides them a return on their investment. We've spoken to some smaller companies in the supply chain, and I guess it's important to recognise that for them, be it a $50 million investment or a $100 million investment, is a massive investment for some companies to be making, and that will bring them undone if there's no end product. So if there's no end user for their business. So we have to work as an industry to give the confidence that this industry will happen. There's multiple projects, there's a pipeline of projects, and there's lots of business for everyone who wants to invest in advance of these projects coming to market.
So would you mind just painting us a picture as to how grand of an infrastructure or associated infrastructure we're going to need? I mean, are we talking that we're going to need dedicated ports for each one of these, I guess, zones that are being created for offshore wind, or is this likely to be requiring augmentation of existing, for example, port facilities? Interested in your thoughts as how big you think the support is going to be.
I think it's huge. Ports are critical for offshore wind. And so we don't believe there's just one port that can be developed to accommodate all projects. We need a combination of ports. You can also use the larger ports, the deeper water ports for the construction and installation facilities, but you can also utilise some of the smaller ports for O&M activities, for crew transfer vessels, and as accommodating some of the other smaller boats. So I think a combination of ports really is critical. The development of a port for an offshore, for a floating wind project is different to the requirements that you need for for a fixed bottom project. So depending on the location of the ports, so up in New South Wales, we'll be looking to the ports up there to develop their infrastructure that accommodates floating projects, whereas down in Victoria, South Australia, we're looking at ports down there to accommodate the larger jack-up vessels that are required for the fixed bottom projects. So we've basically been around to all of the ports. We've discussed them all and assessing their ability and their willingness to invest in their infrastructure to accommodate offshore wind.
And Chris, what are your thoughts on then what are going to be the needs of the supply chain, and what does that also mean for the La Trobe region?
So I think, Sally, one of the big learnings for us, Sally, in terms of as we start to delve into supply chain requirements, is the understanding that it's not all going to happen in one place. To Nick's point around ports, it's the same for steel, for cabling, and the other sort of big componentry that's not going to be necessarily imported directly, prefabricated, essentially. So I think critical from a Gippsland La Trobe perspective is that there's a joined up approach nationally around supply chain, so that those big opportunities, to Matt's point, it will take some time to develop, and it may not be in the early stages of implementation, but as the industry grows and develops, that the big opportunities are shared around the country. Oh, and then we play to respective regional strengths, I might add, Sally. So, this is, I think, I don't want to over egg it, but there's an enormous pressure to get these projects online and producing electricity in order to sustain the market. And some of the projections, Nicola, I'm not going to talk about your shop, but some of the projections in the integrated service systems report make it really clear there's a big change that got to occur in a real hurry, and it's going to take. I think it's going to take everybody giving a bit in order to get a lot. That's how I see it. And if we all sort of focus on our own thing, to Nick's point around how the industry might, develop itself as a whole, if we're all focusing on just fighting for share of cake rather than actually trying to grow the cake together, then we'll end up with less collectively.
And that's really interesting. So I want to come back to that, and we'll come back to the end. But I just wanted to say that we're halfway through our sessions, and please do, we have allowed for some time at the end to go through your questions. So if you do have a question, please post them online on the chat function, and we will come back to you. And thanks to all those who've asked questions so far. Nicola, I want to come to you now on the grid connection, surprise, surprise, and particularly the part that has always perhaps caused me a little bit of restraint of thought, and that is exactly what is our grid strategy for these projects. We see these mandates being 2, 4, they keep going. Are we designing a grid for offshore wind that takes us to where we want to be by 2050, or is it to where we want to be in the first onset? And somewhere there's a balance in that, and there's a difference in costs and how much consumers bear for that availability. What are your thoughts about how we can think about grid in a way that ultimately allows us to have an offshore wind industry, but also is conscious of the costs paid by customers?
Yeah, look, I mean, cost is obviously front of mind for everyone at the moment, but if I maybe just shelve that for a minute and think about it more from a planning perspective, the integrated system plan that we put out does try to give you a bit of a blueprint to what you need to do in the grid through to 2050. The last one that was published was in June 2022. We're already starting to work now on the one for 2024. It didn't have a significant role for offshore wind, but it was noted that there is certainly potential for that offshore wind coming in the future. And since then, these announcements for BitGrid and so forth have been coming on board, and there'll certainly be a better opportunity to start thinking about what that looks like and how that will shape the future grid in our next full system plan. I think that's one of the things that's great about having something like what Vic government's put out, where they're sort of saying 2 gigawatts by 2030 and then eventually progressing up to 9 gigawatts by 2040, means you need to plan the grid thinking about the scale of what's going to be coming in, and then also look at what we know now versus what flexibility we can keep in the plan as it might change and evolve. And that flexibility is going to be really, really important. There was, you asked about the cost to consumers. I think it's that flexibility that actually allows us to make sure that we don't under or over invest in any one point in time, but we always have an eye to where we need to go to be able to facilitate the sort of scale of development that we're talking about. By having that flexibility, if things change, if investor interest happens to be in a different zone than what we'd anticipated or something, we haven't overbuilt, but at the same time, we need to make sure that we think about the system in a different way such that we can always continue to add on and expand as we need to for the future. And that way, make sure, as I said, you don't over and under invest. The other thing, and I see it came up in some of the questions that are coming on, is in doing this, we have to also make sure that we're not losing system resilience. So I just mentioned about flexibility, but I think resilience is also really, really important. Clearly, it wouldn't be a great idea to connect all 9 gigawatts in through one crossing onto a connection point in Victoria. I mean, it's single point of failure would be rather significant if we were to do that, and it wouldn't be a great outcome for Victorians or for the grid. So we need to be thinking about, when you talk about that longer term vision, we need to be also thinking about making sure we don't put further risk on the system, that we don't actually reduce the resilience, create single points of failure or largest contingencies that are actually going to mean that we can't operate the system as securely and reliably. And planning the grid will allow us to be able to do that in a sensible way, which is why you need to think about that future scale and future size of the investment that's coming, even when you're making investment decisions that need to be made today for consumers.
When you hear Nicola think like the way that she's articulated, Nick, as a developer, how does that sound to you?
Yeah, we're very much all for forward planning and thinking about the longer term. I guess one of the concerns we've had is we're hearing targets that probably are a little bit too light. When we're thinking about the sequencing of transmission, there's the potential that you're going to get a significant load coming on at in a very short time period. So yes, that'll be a technical challenge, and that's I hear that's a issue the AEMO level. But what we want to see is the infrastructure developed now, so there's lots of capacity to connect up. We don't want to have projects held up because the grid connection capacity is not there, and I think that's defeating the purpose of really trying to bring these large scale projects on time to provide the valuable replacement of the fossil fuel retirement. So I think very much taking building the infrastructure now that accommodates large scale projects to come on very quickly over time.
And the question that seems to be front of mind is what exactly is the grid solution for some of these, particularly when you're starting to talk 10 gigawatts almost per region. Is this going to require the NEM to sort of think about or to transition away from HVAC to potentially HVDC in situations where you are expecting the offshore wind farms to be at a substantial distance from the shore? Or is that something that that you would perhaps, maybe question to you, Nicola, are you expecting that the proponents should come and form a view collectively on that? Or is that something that AEMO will want to have a view on and then propagate that to the market?
It depends a little bit on whether you're talking about the connection assets or whether you're talking about shared assets and what other value proposition you want to provide from the shared assets. And it's interesting, it's fair to say it's something that we're still getting our heads around. Is often when we're talking about coordination of transmission, we're talking about the shared assets on the mainland. But, if you're starting to talk about significant connection long distances offshore, I know internationally they're also talking about coordination of connection assets offshore, which is something that, we will have to certainly get our heads around what that means. And, is that something that needs to be thought about in the Australian context? But I think, it is always going to be horses for courses to balance up. Is it HVDC, HVAC? What's the value proposition? Certainly from our perspective, or just in general, actually, HVDC is great for point to point. But if you wanted to connect other generation along the route, then that it makes it much more difficult. Obviously, you've got costly conversion stations and so forth at each point. So, HVAC is typically what we've got on the network in Victoria at the moment.
Just another point. Sorry, Sally, I was just going to mention also, I think it's important, when we are doing this major build out of the infrastructure, the transmission infrastructure, important that the initial users, the first users, don't get lumped with the cost of building out the capacity for others to use later, because that's not going to lead to efficient development, and it's going to end up increasing the end user price of electricity. So we need to be cognizant that the transmission system probably has to be overbuilt, and that the initial projects that are connected, they have to connect at a fair and reasonable cost, and not bear the whole cost of it for later projects to come in at cheaper costs.
Yeah, and I think there's often a similar argument. The consumer reps will say that they also shouldn't bear the full cost until something is developed. So, questions around what role government has to play in some of these things is, still to be resolved.
Yeah, a very real role for government.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of, obviously, some of the tensions that we've seen is that there's been a bit of feedback as to whether, if you, for example, develop a 10 gigawatt Gippsland area, what does that mean for the role of other existing transmission routes already en route, for example, Marinus Link? Do you have a view? And obviously, there are lots of schools of thought. Some believe that if this does go ahead and it does happen, it's going to obviously reduce the reliance on Marinus Link and so forth. What do you believe is kind of the interdependency of some of those, transmission decisions that will obviously be fundamental to offshore wind?
Yeah, it's funny actually. A few years ago, I think there was more debate than I'm hearing now. Anyway, that it was an either or. It was offshore wind in Victoria, or it was a Marinus connection up to get some of the resources from Tasmania. But you don't need both. I said at the start of this, the scale of the development we need. I think our task is actually to work out how best to plan the systems that will have a Marinus link, and it will have the offshore wind and everything else that we're going to need onshore as well. So it's more narrow planning rather than an argument, I think, about whether it's Marinus link or offshore wind.
Great answer. I want to maybe just sidestep a little bit and move on to the processes. Now, obviously, we understand this is it's currently in play. I guess what would be interesting to comment on is how you see the state processes fitting in with the federal processes. Certainly, a number of proponents have explained a little bit of confusion about, how many government bodies are going to be involved in getting a single project out. Obviously, I'm sure there's enough collaboration between each state body, but nonetheless, they're distinct processes with their own merit criteria and pathways. What are your observations onto how perhaps optimally this can be managed to ensure that projects do go ahead quickly and at most efficient in costs? Maybe Nick, I'll throw to you first.
Yeah, look, our discussions so far have actually been pretty positive. Both Victoria and New South Wales government, everyone understands the situation the projects are in. Commonwealth territory, crossing through state waters and having state onshore infrastructure. We'll need to go through to environmental approval processes, but I think the states both states are very supportive of offshore wind, and I think there's a bit of competition in order to get the projects off the state and get the regional benefits and with the jobs and the electricity supply. So we've seen a lot of willingness, I think, at the moment, a lot of talk from the states that they want to make sure that their processes do not make it a double process, and that we're not completing all the work twice in order to receive the two approvals. So where possible, we're reasonably confident at this point in time that there's going to be some good collaboration and coordination between Commonwealth and state governments to try and minimise the duplication of work on developers. And it's all about really just trying to bring these projects to market in a timely manner. So time will tell. But I say, to be honest, we've been reasonably happy with the discussions that we've had to date. That there is the willingness, there's the awareness, firstly, that it's a bit of a challenging position, and there's the willingness for both governments to work together and streamline their processes and approvals pathways.
Thanks, Nick. That's very insightful. And maybe a question to you, Nicola, on a similar vein. Obviously, the federal government process has stayed clear of any transmission route discussions or processes, but they have obviously signalled that there will be a process underway. Do you have any sort of insights as to whether that's going to be something that will be run by AEMO, or will that be something that will be run by the federal government at a later date, or perhaps the state governments? In terms of, how are they going to get some thinking on the transmission needs for each of those regions, and perhaps obviously relevant to the Gippslands, of course.
Yeah, well, I can't talk for the Commonwealth. I'm not sure what their plans are, and probably can't talk for any of the other regions as well. But in Victoria, VicGrid has indicated that they'll take the lead on planning that transmission, the coordination of the connection assets with our support and guidance. So I think I know they've got a timetable up on their website, and their what do they call it, implementation statement 1, that talks about when they're going to be in a position to be able to start getting down in the ground and doing the field work for the transmission locations.
Yeah, excellent. Thanks for that. We've got just 2 more topics before you go to your questions, and please do keep putting them through in the chat. A question that's obviously at the heart of all this, and how investable the projects are going to be, and how are we going to ensure that developers have a pathway for a bankable project. Perhaps maybe more broadly is, do we think we have an industry view as to whether these projects and the thinking around project finance and the funding of these projects and the gaps in the funding for these projects, do we believe that's going to be an industry-led, or do we believe that governments and communities are going to play a stronger role in shaping that? And maybe I'll throw to you, Chris, for any comments as to what role the local government would want to have in sort of ensuring there's some consistency there.
So Sally, the feedback I'm getting from local government is principally around resourcing required to support good planning. So from a smoothing the pathways perspective, clearly and interested in that social license piece, job generation, workforce development, and indeed some interesting conversations around research and development and supply chain development. But I think at the end of it all, local government, being able to streamline its planning processes and be resourced to meet the needs of the sector where appropriate, not noting, VicGrid's role in this as well, and indeed the state government itself. But I just think it's that joined up approach and making sure that people understand their role and deliver on their side of the bargain is going to be the key. And that principle may well apply to state government as well.
Well understood. I might bring you into Nick into that question as to, how can we get involved in a more industry-led approach, and how do we what exactly is the ask of government in being able to develop these projects moving forward and getting them to financial close?
Yeah, well, financeability often depends on the commercial agreements, and some of the most important commercial agreements will be the revenue offtake agreements. So I think it's really important that we recognise that there's a lot of benefits of offshore wind and developing offshore wind as a technology amongst solar and onshore wind, the main ones at the moment, and storage options and pumped hydro. So I think to make sure that offshore wind really takes off and is developed timely, then we'd be wanting to see a specific CFD PPA offtake round being run by the government. It's got to be large scale. You can't really have a say a 1 gigawatt program where you've got 100 megawatt solar farms bidding into it against offshore wind, for 2 gigawatt offshore wind generators that are only seeking a small proportion of their output being covered by the CFD or PPA. So what we would like to see is a government-led working with the developers to have a CFD round that is specific for offshore wind and that is large scale to allow a number of projects to be able to receive the benefit of it. And those commercial agreements are crucial in terms of getting the financing and making sure the projects do move beyond the FID point.
No, great answer there. So I'm going to just move on, to some of the great questions that have been posed by the audience. We've got a question here from Gareth Rees, and the question says, does the panel have a view on the cumulative impacts and government taking a broader policy view with the use of regional or strategic environmental and impact assessment approaches? So I believe this question talks about how can there be some cumulative benefits or perhaps ways of managing that given the impact on the environmental assessments. I'm not sure to throw that question to, but maybe perhaps Nick, would you like to start us off?
Sure. I guess, globally we've seen various ways in the community that the community's been able to get involved in offshore wind, and we're big supporters of working with other developers and councils and governments in sharing some of the benefits of these projects. So there's different ways that community benefit funds can work. There's different ways that communities can own parts of the projects. They all require exploring, but it's probably easier said than done. You have to make sure that the benefits are shared and distributed evenly within the communities, and that there's not certain parts of the community that are benefiting while others out. So we're big proponents of working collaboratively with governments, with other developers to work out, well, how can we make sure that there is wide-ranging benefit across the communities, and communities can participate genuinely in the development of the industry. There's no easy answer to it. You can't just come out now and say this is definitely the way to go. Like I said, because we don't want to further inequality within the community by putting up a scheme that is not equally shared amongst everyone.
Okay, and then this is maybe another question in terms of the panel, is whether they think that the challenges will be greater for fixed or floating. And perhaps maybe I might ask you first, Nicola, to comment on whether the grid challenges first would be greater for fixed or floating, and then I'll go to perhaps Nick on the actual offshore wind farm component.
Yeah, sorry, Sally, I actually don't have a view on whether fixed or floating is going to be more difficult from a grid perspective.
Yeah. Nick, from a supply chain perspective, do you think that there might be more challenges for one or the other?
Yeah, we heard in the previous presentation that floating is emerging technologies. There is not a lot of floating wind currently installed globally. So we are. Yeah, the difference between fixed and floating in Australia is with fixed, we're developing projects that have been installed, the technology tried and trusted in the world for quite some time. Whereas floating, we're kind of moving in line with the rest of the world as technologies are developed. There's a massive pipeline of floating projects, but only very little installed capacity. Look, I think it's a regional decision. We have 2 floating projects and 2 fixed bottom projects. We've clearly made the decision in Victoria that we prefer to run with a fixed bottom project. But we've also made the decision that offshore wind works in New South Wales. We want to develop in New South Wales. And unfortunately, the marine environment up there means that you are restricted to floating. So it's not really a matter of choosing. We look at all the sites independently. We work out, well, what technology is best. But we're confident both fixed and floating can work in Australia. Hence, we're developing both the technologies.
Okay, great. So look, just be conscious that we have run out of time, and I apologize about the many other questions that we're not going to get a chance to respond to, but I'm sure some of the presenters will be able to have a look and be able to share it through with the organisers of this. So just as a final remark, if I had a magic wand, and I would love to offer it to all you three. Maybe starting with you, Chris, is what would you like to see happen from your perspective to make offshore wind infrastructure successful in the Australian market?
I think what I would like to see is genuine investment and commitment to the regions where the infrastructure is being placed. I think that an understanding connection to the people and their complex relationship with their country as well is absolutely critical. I think to that end, we need to be really cognizant of the needs and wants of the traditional owners of the country in which we're gathered. But at the end of it all, I think, and this shouldn't come as any surprise, regions around Australia will be interested in jobs, workforce development, a future for their children, building that in region. We probably don't talk about building supply chains. We talk about, opportunities for business to grow and prosper. And I think if you do those things in a genuine sort of partnership, in genuine commitment to place, I think that's what I wish for, and I think that's what both government and industry want. We'll find out in due course.
Indeed, we will. Nicola, what would you like to see happen?
Yeah, a couple of things that probably is a little bit similar to Chris. I mean, first one, I'd love to see costs come down. I think that would be really great. But let's see as we move down that maturity curve, that will be fantastic. And the other thing is that it'd been really great to be able to get a shared vision of what success looks like, and by that I'm talking about for the landowners, the regional benefit sharing, the recognition of the importance of this, and the opportunities that it will bring to the region as well as to all Australians. So I think that shared vision is going to be really important.
Okay, and Nick, over to you. Final remarks. I presume you might have many things that you might wish for.
I got a lot. I'd be very greedy, but I'll be very diplomatic and very collaborative here. And I'd just like to see a culture of forward thinking, and that really goes down to ports development, to supply chain development, to workforce training and skills. I think if we, because otherwise, I guess the biggest danger is that we haven't planned in the future, and that there will be bottlenecks. I think it's inevitable, so that there's as much forward thinking and planning that we can do, and try and set up as many work streams. We'll make sure that the industry really does succeed.
Excellent answers, and look, I hope all those wishes come true, because I think we're going to need all of that to work for us to come together in this sector, bearing in mind that Australia is very fortunate also to have a very strong onshore wind market, and that's really hot on our heels. So it's been a great pleasure to host Nicola Falcon, Nick Sankey, and Chris Buckingham. Thanks very much for your time, and thanks very much, Leader Associates, for hosting this session on the Gippsland. Thanks again.
Thanks, Sally.
Sally.
Yes, thank you, Sally. Thank you all the panelists bring to our excellent final discussion. And I apologize, we can't answer all the questions. We know we are very interested about the Gippsland that. So once again, I seriously appreciate all the speakers today to preparing these speeches in busy schedules, and also thanks all the company of our audience. Today's recording, along with the presentation slides as well as the short clip, will be sent to all the suggestions this Friday. Should you have any questions, please feel free to drop me the message at the below the content. Today's impact is also part of the conference of the official event Australian Wind Energy 2023, to be held in 25 to 26 Australian in the MCEC Melbourne. Over 2,000 APAC wind C-suite are expected to attend this year's show, with already confirmed key stakeholders including Nipsoma, EnergyCo, Goldwind, Courier Generation, Bluefold, Engie, PowerLink, Queensland, and more. Finally, we would like to thank everyone for the company. Australia is seeing crossroads market. We are confident and that wind energy in Australia will be continue booming and growing in the future. Thanks all. See you next time. I seriously appreciate all the speakers today to preparing these speeches in busy schedules, and also thanks all the company of our audience. Today's recording, along with the presentation slides as well as the short clip, will be sent to all the suggestions this Friday. Should you have any questions, please feel free to drop me the message at the below the content. Today's impact is also part of the conference of the official event Australian Wind Energy 2023, to be held in 25 to 26 Australian in the MCEC Melbourne. Over 2,000 APAC wind C-suite are expected to attend this year's show, with already confirmed key stakeholders including Nipsoma, EnergyCo, Goldwind, Courier Generation, Bluefold, Engie, PowerLink, Queensland, and more. Finally, We would like to thank everyone for their company. Australia is saving crucial market. We are confident and that wind energy in Australia will be continue booming and growing in the future. Thanks all. See you next time.